This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Well, we're in mid-September, actually September 14th. That means that tomorrow, September 15th, is the opening day of the New Hampshire fall archery or bow hunting season for deer in New Hampshire. This means there'll be a lot more hunters in the woods. There are a lot more deer hunters than there are for any of the other species. So I think well over 10,000, maybe even 15,000 or more. So a lot of deer hunters will be out beginning tomorrow. So many of them will be parking in the dark and going to their tree stands or their ground blinds in camouflage clothing. They must always wear camouflage clothing. So you're going to see some folks about. It's not the army invading, it's our archery or deer hunters out there. Also, the archery turkey season starts tomorrow. Far fewer of them will be hunting turkeys. Most will be hunting deer. So expect to see cars parked tomorrow morning in places that you haven't been seeing them for quite some time, in on the woods roads or edges of fields and pulled off the barways. So there'll be a lot more vehicles parked in places in New Hampshire's forest and fields over the next several months. They will hunt in the morning, and usually midday. They don't hunt most of the time, and then they'll be back out again an hour or two before sunset. So 4 or 5 in the evening, expect again to see folks arriving, getting out of their cars with their camouflage clothes on and their archery equipment and heading off into New Hampshire's fields and forests. And by the way, they don't come out till it's dark. So you're actually going to see people coming out of the woods at nighttime with flashlights. So don't be alarmed. This happens every year. Our archery hunters are very safe, as is hunting. Hunting is very safe in New Hampshire. So no problem there. Just be aware that there will be numbers of hunters afield beginning tomorrow, September 15th, for the next several months. What else is happening in New Hampshire? Well, I am looking over my house at the big white pine that towers over everything here across the road, and it is loaded with pine cones. It is absolutely loaded. So a great year for pine cones. So that probably means our red squirrel population is going to take a bounce here, and maybe maybe some mice as well. So some years back when I was the fur bearer biologist at New Hampshire Fish and Game, I read a story that came out of, I think, Ontario, where up there, when they had a big spruce or fir cone production year, a phenomenal year for spruce cones, 2 or 3 years later, the pine marten population spiked. So you have a spike of food, in that case, cones in Canada, which precipitated good numbers of red squirrels and mice or voles, and followed by a couple years later by a really big push in the pine marten population. So everything is wound and tied together. All the food bases. We know how the bears are really dependent on food availability. When there's a lack of natural foods, they tend to get into bird feeders and trash and around our homes more often. And when there's a food abundance, they disappear into the woods. So it's not the population of animals that goes up and down for bears. It's the food available which makes them more visible or not. Well, what else is happening? Well, I've seen some monarch butterflies the last few days migrating. This week into next is the peak of hawk migration. I have not seen that many myself. I've seen a few, but not that many. So hawks are migrating south right now. The woods are going to get very quiet. So our toads and frogs, they haven't been calling for a while, but the spring peepers do the fall call a little bit, but they're all going to be going into slumber. So our frogs and toads and snakes and salamanders, all the reptiles and amphibians are about ready to go to sleep for the winter. And where do they go? Well, frogs go into wetlands, ponds, and streams, as do some turtles. A few frogs, spring peepers and wood frogs, well, they just go under the leaf litter and they will freeze this winter. And when the ground gets frozen, they'll be frozen too. So life is really right now, beginning in mid-September, life is really draining out of New Hampshire. The birds are migrating south. The frogs and salamanders and toads are going underground. They're going into the bottom of streams and ponds to sleep. In fact, I remember growing up in Londonderry in the 60s, there were 2 natural springs that bubble up out of the ground in the town there that I could go through in the wintertime. And they could be 3 feet of snow. And when I would go to those springs that were bubbling up and look in there, there were frogs. They were as brown as the mud at the bottom of things. But I could reach in there all winter long and catch a frog if I wanted to. But they weren't very active. They were alive, and they would move, and they would even swim a little bit if you disturbed them. But they were sleeping the winter away in the bottom of that muddy spring. In fact, I was hunting in October in Londonderry one time, and I walked by one of those little springs that bubbled out of the ground right next to Little Coas Marsh, and as I walked by, I could see that the water was all stirred up. It was all muddy. I mean, there was obviously nothing swimming around there, but I could see then as I stood there and stared, I could see that the water, the mud was kind of jigging a little bit. So I took off my coat and rolled up my shirt sleeve and drove my hand into that muck. And what was down there? A snapping turtle going to sleep for the winter. So he had gone into that spring and was burrowing himself into the mud for the winter. And they breathe through their skin. They don't breathe through their mouth anymore. They take in oxygen through their skin and their anus. And that's how they breathe. They breathe through their butt in the wintertime. And that's how they survive a winter. So right now, mid-September into October, life is literally draining from New Hampshire. The birds are migrating south. Some butterflies are migrating south. The bats are migrating south. And frogs and salamanders and turtles and snakes, they're going underground or going into ponds and water. So New Hampshire is, life is just kind of seeping out of New Hampshire right now in late September into October. So things are changing. Still a good time to be outside, very comfortable. The leaves are starting to turn, and as I've said before, we've got a drought going on, so the leaves are turning a little bit earlier this year. So expect some color the next couple of weeks, and so things are happening in New Hampshire. Life is changing before our very eyes. Red button.